Have you been looking for the perfect anamorphic? What if I told you you could get something even more special with a spherical lens? Of all the lenses I should have gotten, I chose a classic 21mm ultrawide. Here's why it's the most thought-provoking focal length in cinema right now. If you haven't been renting movies from Blockbuster, you may have noticed a surge of ultrawide lenses in cinema and commercial work. The reason they're so hot is because of their novelty and bold perspective distortion. High-performing wide-angle lenses have been historically difficult to design, with technical innovation only recently unlocking fast ultrawide cinema glass for solo filmmakers. This development has been expedited by larger sensors, which facilitate the design of distortion-free optics. In full-frame terms, an ultrawide is essentially classified as anything shorter than 24mm, marking the 90-degree tipping point where a lens begins to exhibit perceptibly a natural field of view. What makes the 21mm an unconventional focal length is that it sits on the cusp of this ambiguous transition. It's conservative enough as to not offend traditional moviegoer sensibilities, while still uncanny enough to evoke a surreal impression for hardcore cinephiles. We've seen ultrawides in past cinema, but the commercial appeal for this new iteration comes from their improved image fidelity and depth, elevated by the emerging larger format landscape. These optics maintain sharpness even at absurdly shallow apertures, allowing you to compose stunningly spacious images with fewer hindrances. You'll need to shoot 17:9 full frame to really appreciate its entire scope. Speed, fall-off, dimensionality, clarity, and restraint are the key characteristics here that offer an alternative emotional response from other budget cinema glass. And cinematographers have only just begun to scratch the surface of their utility, venturing into this uncharted frontier of image making. An ultrawide is not particularly easy to compose with. If you've ever used one on a smartphone, you'd recognize that you are often at risk of capturing excessive information into the scene. Many people also don't know how to utilize perspective distortion to their advantage, leading to an unwanted curvature of bodily features like elongated faces or limbs. Objects in the center of the frame will look the most natural, with the objects on the outskirts appearing stretched. This also means that anything nearest to the lens will look comparatively larger to everything else. This is the main element you need to understand in framing a proportional image. For this reason, you'll often see center framing utilized in order to make a 21mm more approachable for narrative work. With contemporary ultrawides being nearly rectilinear, we can now position subjects on the outer edges of the frame without breaking the image. I personally don't care much for perspective distortion, which becomes glaringly apparent in the corner angles. Otherwise, a subtle amount can be endearing. After all, that's what differentiates these lenses from ordinary wides. If you want a standard image with controlled distortion, then sure, shoot head-on for those scenes with dialogue. Depth of field has more creative weight than usual here, as stopping down delivers vast, panoramic context, whereas blurring the background can create beautiful focus on your subject. Compelling bokeh can also be accomplished by simply advancing to an arm's length away from your subject. This compensates for the loss of compression from switching to a wider focal length by retaining an equivalent field of view. At macro levels, I think this lens looks better from the side, which won't distort as many facial features. But if you do want to convey paranoia, fear, or confusion, an ultrawide can employ angles associated with such emotions by simply panning and tilting. Each quadrant of an ultrawide can distort reality, becoming increasingly audacious the more you stray from the center camera axis. Shooting from above someone's head makes their body look smaller and further away, which could be suitable to express fear, uncertainty, or vulnerability. Shooting from below generates more intimacy by inhabiting the character's viewpoint, which could be appropriate to communicate contemplation, discovery, or power. I personally think shoulder level and above is most fitting for narrative storytelling. The primary decision to consider on a 21mm is how to handle the expansive field of view. You can implement aspect ratios like 2.39 to tame the vertical height. Black bars with spherical lenses were always competing for the approval of anamorphic lovers, until ultrawides ushered in a new style of cinemascope. Their peripheral real estate and perspective distortion is analogous to the warped outlook of anamorphism, all while distinguishing itself with the ability to highlight negative space. Maximizing empty space can dwarf a person and become an entity on its own, fostering a sense of helplessness or signaling that something is amiss. This is immensely applicable for horror themes, as what we don't see is often more threatening than what we can see. Deliberately framing innocuous objects, menacing doorways, and dark corners provide filmmakers another tool to build suspense and tension. Normally, letterboxing elicits a sense of freedom, but here, its excess can be chaotic, splitting the audience's attention and directing their gaze to anxiously wander across the screen, searching for potential dangers that might pop out at any moment. There's no terror in the bang, only an anticipation of it, which is also pretty much how I feel about the Arles. For those that don't care for technical analysis, you can skip to the end. All the footage you've seen was shot on the dzofilm Arles 21mm T1.4. This housing is impeccably machined to seamlessly integrate with professional workflows. It comes in PL or EF mount for you to shim to your specifications, meaning no electronic communication with the camera. It instead uses a clickless aperture ring from T1.4 to T22, which is actually very useful for adjusting exposure while recording, but not great for precise setting. It's a beefy boy, weighing more than my Zeiss Otis at 1.5 kilograms. If you're comfortable with the size and weight of the Otis 28mm, you should have no problem with the Arles. What you will not get used to is the handling. This is primarily for cinema rigs, indicated by its long focus throw of 270 degrees, which is perfect for follow focus systems, not ideal for handheld work. You will need at least 2 massive hand rotations to go from minimum focus to infinity. My initial experience was a frustration, unable to confidently discern critical focus since it's not as sharp as Zeiss. This was aggravated by the questionable flaring, which further reduces its softer contrast. I would also accidentally shift aperture because the gears are quite close to each other, making the overall handheld experience discouraging. I expected these inconveniences even before I bought the lens, but there was a silver lining. Manually manipulating focus should be manageable as long as you maintain distance from your subject. The majority of the focus ring runs along 1 to 3 feet. Farther ranges allow shorter adjustments, so as long as your person isn't bouncing back and forth 2 feet away, you can still run and gun with this lens. The 21mm is not rectilinear, with reportedly 2% distortion. I actually found it charming as long as there's no one on the extreme edges, but there can regrettably be bent lines at certain angles. Bear in mind, even some RE signature primes can have 1% distortion. This is also a factor that can positively affect the dimensionality of an image. I would say the 3D pop of the Arles is nearly comparable to the Otis, and might even be preferable overall due to its desirable level of sharpness. With less contrast and acutance, DZO really seems to be taking cues from signature primes, which are similarly designed to balance with HDR content and high-resolution sensors. Reviewing what I've shot on the Sigma FP, I believe the softer look will be a crowd pleaser for those wanting a more organic rendering while also resembling Hollywood lenses. Unfortunately, the Arles is nowhere near as pristine in performance coming from Zeiss. Although the 16 aperture blades consistently form painterly round bokeh, the out-of-focus transition can be deceptively coarse. The falloff reliably becomes polluted once you film outside at low apertures, producing aggressively fuzzy background foliage. This fault occurs at any point where blurry elements are near the plane of focus. Its astigmatism at T1.4 can be reminiscent of some vintage pre-war bokeh or a really bad zit, quite wide from the mark of a signature prime. Perhaps my standards are too high, or maybe I'm seeing ghosts in the frames. Quality control or not, paying $3,000 for this level of quality haunts me considering it's more expensive than any cinema purchase I've made. Once I've received a replacement, I'll confirm whether or not these shortcomings were a defect with a long-term written review on my blog. This makes it so I avoid T1.4 unless necessary, which is actually not a deal breaker. The purple fringing and distracting bokeh fortunately improves around T2. At T2.8, its performance is more than satisfactory and distinctly clean at T4 and above. What you can't control is the color accuracy. dzofilm has historically designed warmer optics like the Vespids, and the Arles are no different, at least 300 Kelvin warmer than the Otis. This shift might be complementary with vintage color grades, but if you want neutral colors, solely lowering white balance still yields a yellow cast and less color separation overall. The Arles does have one ace up its sleeve. On my 16:9 sensor, the coverage of the 21mm has visibly more vignetting than the 28 Otis, but the light transmission is more efficient, impressively capturing around half a stop more light at T1.4 than f1.4 on the Otis. It also has superior minimum focus and unexpectedly phenomenal focus breathing. So despite the critique, I still admire the Arles, as there's nothing else that looks as premium on the prosumer market for this focal length. The standard A set will undoubtedly have fewer flaws, so take these demerits with a grain of salt, as ultrawides always have imperfections, only drawing criticism by contrast of their compromised beauty. Even with the sins at T1.4, it still looks immaculate at other stops and will be appealing for those that desire an Otis but want something with more character. The Arles propose a dependable trade-off, though the notion might be unpalatable as the Otis has better optical performance while also being cheaper used. Until you realize, the Arles is far and wide the only contender for fast 21mm, warranting its retail price. For less flexible image quality enthusiasts, we'll just have to continue praying every night to Carl Zeiss for an expanded Otis lineup. Cinematography is in a peculiar state right now. It has become a craft glorifying technical knowledge in place of artistic direction, with many aspiring filmmakers solely pursuing gear-related results. With technical invention at the forefront of the filmmaking community, it has largely been a distraction from what's really at the foundation of cinema: visual storytelling. Image quality is only half of this equation. Researching lighting, cameras, and lenses is necessary to achieve your technical vision. But without subjective camera technique, you're left with beautifully shallow and ultimately pointless visuals. Lost in the spec sheets, we've forgotten that we originally picked up the camera to capture emotions and tell meaningful stories. The dzofilm Arles is a powerful image-making tool, but only if you're willing to explore its emotional depth. It's time to look wider through the looking glass.